The transmission came in at 0317, and nobody was ready for it. I was in the med bay of the Callaway, elbow deep in a supply crate, counting bandage rolls, when the ship's speakers cut out mid-song, and a voice filled every corridor. Not a human voice. It had a texture like gravel sliding down glass, and it came with its own translation, preloaded into our communication array, as if whoever sent it had already decided we were too primitive to manage it ourselves. You are being addressed by Her Eternal Majesty, Queen of the Vareth Dominion, first of her line, sovereign of 43 systems. You have been assessed. Your species presents no military challenge. Your resources are of moderate value. You will cease all resistance activities, open your orbital platforms within 72 hours, and await collection teams. Non-compliance will result in full planetary processing. This is the only communication you will receive. Then silence. I stood there holding a roll of gauze, and I thought, collection teams, like we were fruit. My name is Mara Voss. I was 29 years old, a sergeant and field medic aboard the exploration vessel Callaway, which was not a warship. It had 2 mounted rail turrets for asteroid deflection, and a crew of 41. We had been 9 months into a mapping mission in the outer system, when the Varath fleet dropped out of deep space 4 days earlier, and the world changed so fast that most people back on Earth had not yet processed the first change, before the second one arrived. We knew because Lieutenant Addie Price had spent the previous 72 hours doing nothing but counting them on long-range scan, and every time she counted, she got a slightly different number, because they kept moving, reorganizing, shifting in formations that our computers flagged as tactically unfamiliar. 312 ships. Earth had 11 in active commission, 11, and most of them were not designed to fight anything. Captain Owen Drake called us to the common room 20 minutes after the broadcast. He was a tall man with a quiet voice, and he never raised it, not even now, which somehow made everything feel more serious rather than less. I want to be clear about what we know, he said. The Varath have been in this region of space for approximately 1 billion years, by their own historical records, which our linguists have been decoding since the first contact signal, 48 hours ago. In that time, they have absorbed or eliminated 61 other intelligent species. Of those 61, 14 attempted resistance. None of those 14 still exist. Nobody spoke. We have received a response from Earth Command, he continued. The Global Council is in emergency session. They are requesting all crew of all active vessels maintain position and await orders. That is the current directive. Addie raised her hand. What orders are we expecting, sir? Because I have been looking at their fleet formation for 3 days, and I want to be honest with you. If they decide to move, we cannot slow them down. We cannot stop them. We can delay them by about 4 minutes. Drake nodded slowly. I know. So what do we do? He looked around the room. 41 faces, all of them frightened, all of them looking at him for something. He gave them the only honest thing he had. We wait to see what kind of people we are, he said. The vote in the Global Council took 9 hours. I watched it on the common room screen with 11 other crew members. The arguments went back and forth. Survival at any cost versus refusal at any cost. Surrender dressed up in diplomatic language versus defiance dressed up in suicidal language. There were people on that council floor who wept. There were people who shouted. There was one representative, a woman named Carol Brent from the coastal territories, who stood up in the middle of a shouting match and said very quietly, "We have spent our entire history surviving things we should not have survived. I am not going to be the generation that decides we stop." The room quieted. She kept going. They called us prey things. I heard the translation. I want to know what prey thing ever looked up at the thing trying to eat it and said no. The vote passed by a margin of 4. It was not unanimous. It was not clean, but it passed. Earth's response was transmitted on every Varath frequency 2 hours later. Our linguistics team had spent those 2 hours trying to find a Varath equivalent for the word they wanted to send, and they could not find one. The Varath database, vast as it was, had no entry for refusal without conditions, denial without negotiation, a flat and unconditional rejection from a species that had no reasonable chance of winning. So they sent it in English. One word, plain text, no translation offered. No. Back on the Callaway, I was in the med bay again, when Addie knocked on the doorframe. She had her tablet under her arm, and her expression was the particular kind of calm that people wear when they have already gone through the fear and come out the other side of it into something steadier. "They received it," she said. "And? Their fleet just changed formation." She held up the tablet. On it, 312 bright points of light were shifting, rearranging, moving in a way that our threat recognition software flagged in large red letters. "They are coming." I looked at the screen, then I looked at my med bay. I had enough supplies for a crew of 41. I had 2 surgical units, 4 beds, and a cabinet of medications that would have been impressive in any rural hospital on Earth. "How long?" I asked. "Outer solar system in about 19 hours, she said. "We will be the first ones they reach." I thought about that. I thought about Carol Brent's voice. I thought about the word no, floating out there in the dark, between us and 312 ships that had never lost. "Then I guess I should recount the bandages," I said. Addie almost smiled. "Yeah," she said. "I guess you should." She left, and I turned back to my crate, and I started counting. My hands were steady. I noticed that, and I filed it away, because it surprised me. I had expected to be more afraid. I was afraid, certainly, in the background, in the part of my mind that was doing arithmetic about ships and weapons and odds. But there was something else there, too. Something that did not have a clean name. The Callaway had been built to explore. Its hull had taken micrometeorite impacts and radiation surges and the cold silence of deep space for 11 years. Its crew had fixed its engines with parts they improvised, from whatever was available. They had mapped 412 previously uncharted celestial bodies and named every single one of them, even the ugly ones, because that is what humans do. We name things. We claim things. We decide that something matters even when no one else agrees. 19 hours. I finished counting the bandages. I had enough. I went to sleep because a tired medic is a useless medic, and because sleep is one of the things humans are surprisingly good at doing, even when the world is ending. Outside, in the dark, the Varath fleet was moving. And the word no was still out there, traveling at the speed of light, getting smaller and smaller against the size of everything. But still there. Still traveling. Still exactly what it was. The first shot of what people would later call the Oort engagement was fired by a man named Pete Garland, a railgunner on the survey ship Hendrix, who had never fired at anything larger than a rogue ice chunk in his 6 years of service. He did not wait for orders. He saw the Varath advance probe, a single fast-moving scout vessel about the size of a city bus, come within range of the Hendrix, and he fired. The shot went wide. The second one clipped the probe's rear housing and sent it spinning. The third one ended it. Pete later said that he was not thinking about anything in particular when he fired. He was thinking about his daughter's school play, which he had missed 3 years in a row because of deployment schedules, and which he was supposed to attend in 2 weeks. He wanted to be there for it. That was his whole reason. He wanted to be there for a school play. The Varath recorded the engagement. Their analysis noted that the human vessel that opened fire was outgunned by a ratio of approximately 40-1, had no logical tactical advantage in engaging, and did so anyway, with no hesitation and poor aim. Their strategic assessment categorized the action as irrational. In their experience, irrational behavior from an inferior species meant desperation. Desperation meant the species was already broken. They adjusted their formation accordingly, expecting collapse. They were wrong about that. I watched the battle from the medbay of the Callaway, which had been repositioned into the outer debris field of the Oort cloud on Captain Drake's order. We were not a weapons platform. We were a medical and support vessel, and Drake had made a decision that felt like madness, and also felt completely right, which was a combination I was starting to associate with humans at their best. He had ordered the Callaway into the densest part of the debris field, where our smaller profile and better maneuvering thrusters gave us an advantage the Varath heavies could not match. "We are going to pull people out," he told us. "Whatever happens out there, we are going to pull people out." So that is what we did. The 11 Earth vessels did not fight like a fleet. They fought like 11 different ideas about how to survive, and somehow that incoherence worked. The Varath commanders, who had spent 1,000 years fighting wars that followed rules, could not adapt to an enemy that did not seem to have any. Captain Lena Holt of the Fairbridge took her ship straight at a Verath destroyer and then pulled a lateral roll at the last possible moment, using the destroyer's own engine wash to slingshot back around for a rear shot. Nobody had planned that maneuver. Lena had made it up in about 4 seconds. Commander Greg Ashby of the Northfield used his vessel's cargo bay, still full of mining equipment, as an improvised weapon, opening the bay doors and letting 1,000 tons of unsecured drilling machinery tumble into the path of 2 incoming Verath fighters. The Verath had extremely sophisticated point defense systems. They were not designed to handle loose equipment moving in unpredictable tumbling patterns. I spent those hours doing what I had been trained to do. The Callaway moved through the debris field in controlled bursts, Drake navigating by instinct, and Addie calling out gap windows in the Verath sensor net. We reached the Hendricks after Pete Garland's second engagement had left her with a cracked hull section and 3 crew members who needed immediate care. We pulled alongside and cycled the airlock, and those 3 people came through into my med bay, and I worked on them while the ship shook around me from impacts that Drake was doing his best to avoid. Pete Garland was one of the 3. He had a fragment wound along his left arm and a look on his face like a man who had just realized something large and permanent. I cleaned the wound and closed it while he stared at the ceiling. "How's the Hendricks?" he asked. "Still flying," I said, which was true. Barely, but true. "Good," he said. "I need to get back on the guns. You need to stay in this bed for at least 2 hours." He looked at me. He was 44 years old, with gray at his temples, and a wedding ring he kept turning with his right thumb. "My daughter's in school right now," he said. "Back on Earth. She started her day 3 hours ago. She doesn't know any of this is happening." "No," I agreed. "I'd like to keep it that way. I'd like her to still have a planet to go to school on." I secured the bandage and looked at him. 2 hours, I said. "Then I'll walk you back to the Hendricks myself." He nodded and lay back and was asleep in less than 4 minutes, which is one of the things people who have been through real difficulty learn to do. You sleep when you can. You rest in the gaps. You carry on. The battle lasted 11 hours. When it was over, humanity had lost 2 ships. The crews of both had mostly been recovered. Drake had spent 9 of those 11 hours on extraction runs, pushing the Callaway into places it had no business being and getting out again on nerve and timing. The Verath had lost 43 ships. 43. In 11 hours. Against 11 vessels and a crew of people who were making things up as they went. The Verath did not retreat, exactly. They reorganized. They pulled back to the edge of the debris field and held position, and their communications went quiet. And our analysts spent the next 16 hours trying to figure out what that silence meant. I spent those 16 hours sleeping, eating, and writing a letter to my mother that I was not certain she would ever receive. I told her about Pete Garland. I told her about Drake and Addie and Lena Holt and Greg Ashby. I told her that I had expected to be more afraid, and I still was not sure what to make of that. I told her that the sky outside the Callaway was full of debris and distant light, and the wreckage of things that used to be ships, and that it was one of the strangest and most terrible sights I had ever seen, and that I could not stop looking at it. I told her that I thought we were going to keep going. I did not know why I believed that. I just did. The Verath silence ended at hour 17. A new transmission came through, this one not addressed to Earth, not to any specific vessel. It was addressed, according to our linguistics team, to what the Verath called the collective combatant entity of the third planet, which was their way of saying they still could not quite fit us into a category they understood. The message was short. "You will be given one final opportunity to surrender. Be aware that what follows will not be a fleet engagement. What follows will be the death swarm. You have no answer for the death swarm. No species has ever found one." Addie read it aloud to the crew. She had a steady voice, Addie did. She read it the way you read a weather report, factually and without drama. Then she set down her tablet and said, "So, anyone know what a death swarm is?" Nobody did, not yet. But we were about to find out. The death swarm arrived in the inner solar system on a Tuesday. I remember the day because I had been keeping track of Earth days deliberately, as a way of staying connected to something normal. It was a Tuesday, and somewhere on Earth, millions of people were going to work, and dropping their children at school, and drinking their morning coffee, and watching the sky, and wondering what was coming. What was coming was 10,000 drone ships, each one no larger than a cargo container, each one guided by an artificial intelligence that had been learning from warfare for 400 years. They did not move like a fleet. They moved like a living thing, a shape that shifted and breathed and responded. They were not fast, individually, but together, they were constant, like water finding every possible gap. Earth's response was everything. I do not mean that metaphorically. Every vessel that could move was moving. The 11 military ships, yes, but also cargo haulers from the Mars supply run, mining drones that had been reprogrammed overnight by teams of engineers working on no sleep, orbital station platforms that had detached from their moorings and were now, technically, spacecraft. A water delivery barge called the Mildred, piloted by a 67-year-old woman named Dorothy Ware, who had been a supply worker for 40 years, and who, when asked later why she had volunteered, said simply, "I have grandchildren. Where else would I be?" The death swarm adapted. That was what it did. Every tactic it encountered, it logged, analyzed, and countered. When the military ships feinted left, it sealed left. When the cargo haulers tried a pincer move, it opened the pincer and closed it around them. It was learning in real time, updating in fractions of a second, perfectly patient and perfectly logical. What it could not adapt to was Dorothy Ware. Dorothy flew the Mildred in a straight line at the center of the death swarm formation, which was not a tactic. It was not a feint, or a strategy, or a calculated sacrifice. It was a 67-year-old woman, deciding that she was going to go forward. The death swarm's targeting systems analyzed her approach, predicted her vector, projected her most likely tactical objective, and found no match in its database. There was no match, because there was no tactical objective. There was just Dorothy, going forward. She pulled away at the last possible moment. The Mildred lost its rear cooling array and took damage to 2 of its 4 thrusters. Dorothy was uninjured. She circled back and went forward again. The death swarm spent 0.003 seconds processing this, which in AI terms is a very long time, and flagged it as an anomaly. Anomalies accumulated. On Mars Station, in a pressurized habitat that had been partially converted into a makeshift engineering bay, 4 teenagers had gotten hold of a Verath drone that had been disabled during the ORT engagement and brought in for study. Their names were Cal, Nora, Pete Jr., Pete Garland's son, who had joined his father on the Hendrix before the whole thing started, and a girl everyone called Sparks, because no one could pronounce her actual name correctly on the first try. They were 15, 16, 17, and 15 respectively. They had been given access to the drone by a harried researcher who had told them not to touch anything critical. They touched everything. In 71 hours, using tools they had partly improvised and parts they had pulled from a broken coffee machine, a damaged solar panel array, and the guts of 3 outdated communication relays, they had reverse-engineered the drone's targeting subroutine. Not all of it. Enough. Enough to understand that the death swarm units communicated on a frequency band that no human equipment had been designed to interfere with, because no one had known the frequency existed. Cal wrote the interference code on a whiteboard first, in ordinary marker, working through it step by step the way his physics teacher had taught him. Nora debugged it. Sparks built the transmitter. Pete Jr. tested it by pointing it at the disabled drone and watching it try to receive a signal it could not process. The drone's status light flickered in a way that had never been recorded before. They transmitted the findings to Earth Command at hour 69. An engineer named Donna Webb, who had been awake for 31 hours straight, read the message, read it again, and then got on the intercom and said, in a voice that was extremely calm for someone who had just understood what she was reading, "I need everyone on Gamma Team to stop what they are doing and come look at this." It took 12 hours to scale the transmitter up. It took another 4 to get it positioned. It took 6 minutes of broadcast to do something that no intelligence in recorded Verath history had ever done to the death swarm. It made it confused. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Confused. The death swarm units began sending queries back to their central coordination node at a rate that overloaded the node's processing capacity. They were receiving a signal they could not categorize, from a species they could not model, using technology that should not have existed given humanity's assessed developmental level, built partly from a broken coffee machine. The death swarm halted. In the middle of the inner solar system, 10,000 ships stopped moving. They floated there, holding position, continuing to send queries that their own systems could not answer. And then, for the first time in 400 years of continuous operation, the Death Swarm's central coordination system sent a message back to the Verath fleet. Not a status report, a question. The translation, when our linguists worked through it, came out as something close to, "Please define the expected outcome condition for this engagement against an adversary whose behavioral parameters cannot be resolved into any known category." In simpler terms, it was asking its creators what winning even meant against us. The Queen received the message. I was not there for that, of course. I was in the medbay of the Callaway, which had by then made 17 extraction runs and was running low on hull sealant and high on patience. Pete Garland was with me again, not as a patient this time, but because he had taken to sitting in the medbay between his shifts on the Hendrix and talking to people who needed someone to talk to. He was good at it. He had a calm way of just being present that I have since come to think of as a talent, the same kind of talent as being good at surgery or navigation, except that the world does not give it a name because it is invisible. "They stopped," he said, looking at the feed on my wall screen. "The Death Swarm, motionless. 10,000 ships, just hanging there." "Yes," I said. "Why?" I thought about how to explain what the engineers had done, and decided to go with the simplest version. "Because we did something they did not expect." Pete looked at the screen for a long time. "We do that a lot," he said. "Don't we?" It was not really a question. "Yes," I said. "I think we do." Outside, the Death Swarm was still waiting for an answer it was not going to get. Inside, the Callaway was quiet, in the way that things are quiet after a long stretch of noise, when the silence itself feels like a weight you are learning to carry. Somewhere out there, the Queen was looking at a message from her greatest weapon, asking her to explain what winning meant. And she did not have an answer. That was when things began to change. The ceasefire was not declared. It arrived the way some things arrive, not as a decision but as a fact. The Death Swarm stopped moving and did not start again. The Verath fleet, still positioned at the outer solar system's edge, held its formation, but sent no new weapons and made no further advance. Earth's communication teams began receiving a new kind of signal from the Verath flagship, a steady, low-frequency tone that our linguists identified after 6 hours as a request for dialogue. Not a demand, a request. Earth Command argued about who to send for another 12 hours. They went through the expected names, the diplomats and the generals and the specialists in alien communication, and then someone on the committee, a quiet man named Arthur Cole who had barely spoken during the previous 4 days of crisis meetings, said, "We should send the medic." People looked at him. He explained, "The Queen received our casualty reports. We know she can access them because she responded to our communications on a frequency keyed to our medical transponder band, which means she was specifically looking at our medical data. She has seen who we treated and how we treated them. That includes the Verath wounded." There was silence in the room. "We recovered 7 Verath drone pilots from disabled ships during the Ort engagement," Arthur continued. "Protocol was to assess them as potential intelligence sources. Instead, our medical crews treated their injuries first and asked questions second. Some of those pilots were treated by a medic named Mara Voss aboard the Callaway. The Queen has specifically referenced that vessel's medical logs in her dialogue request. So that was how I found out that the most powerful sovereign in 43 star systems had been reading my charts. I was given 2 hours to prepare. I spent one of them sitting with Pete in the medbay, not talking much, just being in the same room. I spent the other one writing a second letter to my mother, because I thought it was reasonable to cover my bases. Captain Drake flew me to the Verath flagship himself, in the Callaway's shuttle. It took 4 hours. We did not talk much either. Drake was a man who understood that some moments did not need filling with words, and I had come to value that about him more than almost anything else. The flagship was enormous, in a way that is hard to describe. It was not just large, it was ancient, in the way that mountains are ancient, in a way that communicates time, rather than just size. Its hull was layered with markings that my suit's scanner identified as approximately 9,000 years of accumulated records. Names and battles and systems, and the faces of conquered peoples. carved into metal that had lasted longer than most human civilizations. I walked through its corridors accompanied by 2 Verath guards who were each about twice my height, and moved with the slow certainty of things that had never needed to hurry. The corridors smelled like deep ocean and something electrical. The lights were dim and blue. Everything was very quiet. The Queen's chamber was at the center of the ship. She was nothing like what I had imagined, and I had imagined a great deal in 4 hours of transit. She was large, yes, 12 feet at least, with 4 upper limbs and a body that was armored in what might have been natural chitin, or might have been constructed, I could not tell. Her face, if face was the right word, was arranged around 4 eyes, widely spaced, and each one was a different color. They moved independently. They were watching me from 4 different angles at once. She was surrounded by her court, dozens of Verath, all standing in careful arrangement, all watching me. None of them spoke. The silence was total. I was aware that I was a very small human in a very large room on a ship that had been fighting wars since before my civilization had invented the wheel. I was aware of all of this, and my hands were steady. The Queen spoke. The translator rendered her words in a tone that was lower than I expected, and slower, as if she was choosing each one carefully. "You are the one who treated our injured," she said. "Yes," I said, before questioning them. "Yes." One of the 4 eyes shifted, just slightly. "Why?" I thought about how to answer that, and decided the most honest answer was the best one. "Because they were hurt," I said. "You treat people who are hurt. That comes first." Another silence. Somewhere in the court, something shifted, a small sound, like a breath, drawn and released. "You are at war with us," the Queen said. "Yes." "And you treated our people." "Yes." This is not logical. I looked up at her. 4 different eyes looking back at me from 4 different angles, ancient and enormous, and genuinely puzzled, and I thought, she is not being cruel, she is not mocking, she actually does not understand. She has been alive for so long, in a civilization so powerful, that the concept of treating an enemy's wounded had simply never occurred to her as a possible choice. Not because she was cruel, but because it had never been necessary. She had never needed to think about it. "No," I said. "It's not logical. It's just what we do." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Show me." I had not expected that. "Show you?" "What you are. Show me." I had brought nothing with me, except my medical kit and a tablet with my personal files. I looked at the tablet. I had photographs and letters and recordings. I had 17 months of journal entries. I had a video that Pete's daughter had sent him after the school play, the one he had missed, which he had shared with me because he said I needed to see it. I pulled up the video and held the tablet out toward the Queen, and a screen on the wall behind me, some kind of display system, picked up the signal and enlarged it. A girl, maybe 9 years old, standing on a school stage in a costume made of cardboard and painted cloth, performing a scene from an old play about explorers. She forgot one of her lines. Her teacher whispered it from the side. She found it, delivered it with total confidence, and grinned at the audience in a way that was completely unself-conscious and completely joyful. The Queen watched it. Then I showed her the footage from the Ort engagement. Not the weapons, the recovery runs, the Callaway sliding through debris fields to pull people out of damaged ships. I showed her Dorothy Ware and the Mildred, 67 years old, going forward. I showed her the 4 teenagers in the Mars habitat, working on a whiteboard, arguing loudly, Cal erasing something and Nora laughing at him. I showed her Pete Garland asleep in my medbay, which I had not planned to show anyone, but it was there, and it felt true. This man who wanted to see his daughters play, sleeping in the gap between one crisis and the next, trusting that he could rest because someone else was watching. I showed her my mother's garden, which she had filmed for me before I deployed. Just 10 seconds of tomato plants in the morning light. The Queen's court was silent throughout. Some of them leaned forward slightly. Some of them moved their own eyes in ways I could not read. The Queen herself did not move at all, but something in her posture changed, something subtle and large at the same time, like a shift in weather. When the tablet ran out of things I had queued, I turned it off. "What is the word?" the Queen said slowly, "for a species that chooses to be kind during conflict?" I thought about it. I don't think we have one specific word, I said. We just call it being human. Being human, she repeated. The translator gave the words a flat sound, but something in the way she said them suggested she was setting them somewhere careful in her memory. One of her advisors spoke, a quick burst of Verath that my translator caught as something like the phrase, contagious courage. Another one said something that came through as beautiful and without sense. A third one was quiet for a long time, and then said a word my translator could not find an equivalent for at all, and rendered as, the state of choosing to continue beyond the point of reason. I looked at the Queen. You were not afraid of us at first, I said. No, she agreed. And now? She was quiet for a long moment. I have existed for 4,000 years, she said. My empire has expanded without loss for the last 2,000 of them. My warriors have no word for retreat in any of our 43 dialects, because there has been no reason to create one. She paused. Your species has existed, by our records, for less than 300,000 years. You have spent most of that time fighting each other. Your planet has been struck by catastrophes that should have eliminated you 14 separate times by our geological survey. But they didn't, I said. No, she said, they did not. She looked at me with all four eyes at once, which I had not experienced before, and which was more attention than I had ever felt from any living thing. You are afraid, she said. You were afraid when you sent that word to us. I know fear. I have studied it in 61 species. Every one of them had fear in their final transmission. Yes, I said. We were afraid. And you refused anyway. Yes. Why? This time I did not think about my answer. It came out on its own. Because the fear wasn't the most important thing, I said. What we wanted was more important than what we were afraid of. She looked at me for a very long time. The room was so quiet I could hear my own pulse. We have forgotten that, she said. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. It was just a fact, delivered in the same tone she might use to describe a star's position. But it was the most significant thing she had said, and I think we both knew it. Outside, the death swarm was still waiting for instructions. 43 years of victories lined the walls of this ship. The silence of 61 extinct species was in here somewhere too, if I thought about it, and I tried not to. I thought instead about Pete's daughter on a stage, grinning at a crowd. What happens now? I asked. The Queen was quiet for a moment. Then she said something to her court that my translator rendered as, prepare the treaty chamber. Her court stirred. Some of them seemed surprised. Some of them seemed uncertain. None of them argued. You do not argue with someone who has been queen for 4,000 years. She looked back at me. The terms, she said. You have terms. Yes, I said. Present them. I opened my tablet to the document Earth Command had transmitted to me 2 hours before departure. I had read it 4 times on the transit flight, and each time I had felt the same thing, a kind of quiet pride that was not about winning or power, but about character, about what we had decided to be when we had every reason to be something else. The terms were generous. No occupation of Verath space, no reparations, no demands for weapons or resources or territory, a mutual withdrawal to established boundaries, an open framework for trade, a seat on a new council, to include representatives from all species the Verath had previously absorbed, all of whom would be contacted by Earth to begin the process of re-establishing their autonomy. And one final item, a single clause at the end. Humanity asked for nothing except this, that the word for what we had done, the refusing and the continuing, and the treating of the wounded, and the going forward, be added to the Verath language, that it exist, that it have a name. The Queen read the terms. The translation process was slow. I stood there and waited. The court watched. She reached the last clause. She read it twice. Then she set the tablet down and was quiet for a long time, and I realized that the silence in the room had changed, that it had the texture of something unexpected, something that the court had not prepared for. You ask for nothing, she said, for yourselves. We ask for one word, I said. A word. Words matter, I said. To us, they matter a great deal. She looked at the last clause for another moment. Then she looked up, and she did something that I do not think anyone in her court had seen before. I do not think she had done it in a very long time. She lowered herself. Not all the way to the floor, but enough. A deliberate, conscious choice to take up less space than she occupied. 4,000 years of sovereignty and certainty and unbroken conquest. And she lowered herself. "We accept the terms," she said. The room made a sound that I had no framework for. Not human sounds. Not approval or surprise exactly. Something older and more complicated. One of her advisors stepped forward and spoke to me. My translator caught it clearly. In 43 systems and 61 encountered species, Her Majesty has never done this. "I know," I said. "Are you not pleased?" I thought about the right answer. "I am glad," I said. "That is different from pleased. Pleased is about winning. Glad is about what comes next." The advisor was quiet for a moment. Then they said something to their colleague beside them, quietly, in Varath. My translator caught it but struggled, and the best it could render was a compound concept, something like, "These creatures understand the difference between the end of a war and the beginning of a peace, and that they are not the same." The treaty signing took place 3 days later. Earth Command had debated the location. The Varath flagship was proposed. A neutral station was proposed. Someone suggested the United Nations building in Geneva. Drake suggested the Callaway. It was not a dramatic ship. It was a mapping vessel that had been in service for 11 years and had the scuffs to prove it. Its medical bay had 42 stitched patients in its log from the previous 3 weeks. Its hull had patches on patches. Its coffee machine had been broken for 2 months, and nobody had fixed it because there were always more urgent things. It was the most human place I could think of. The Queen came aboard with 4 advisors. She had to bend to fit through the corridors, which she did without comment, with a kind of careful dignity that I found quietly remarkable. Drake met her at the airlock and shook one of her hands, because he was Drake, and because it felt right, and because she allowed it. We gathered in the common room, which was the largest space on the ship. It fit us all, barely. The lighting was the standard warm yellow of the Callaway's common spaces. Someone had put a bowl of fruit on the table from the ship's stores, apples and oranges and 2 very tired-looking pears, because we were out of almost everything else. Later I would think about those pears for a long time. Something about them made me feel very specifically like myself. The treaty document had been printed on real paper. Earth had insisted on that. 2 copies. One for us, one for the Varath. The Queen signed first. She held the pen the way a person holds something fragile and unfamiliar, carefully and with attention. Her signature was 4 marks, one for each of her eyes by tradition, arranged in a pattern that her advisor told me represented the concept of witness, of having truly seen something. Then Drake looked at me. "You should sign," he said. "I am a sergeant," I said. "I am a medic. You are the reason she is sitting at this table," he said. "Sign." I looked around the room. Addie, Pete Garland, whose arm had healed well. The Queen's court, watching. The Queen herself, patient, ancient, and something else now. Something that was harder to name. Something that had not been there when I first walked into her chamber. Something closer to the beginning of curiosity than the end of certainty. I signed. My handwriting was not particularly impressive. It was the handwriting of someone who had spent years writing quick notes in medbays, compact and a little slanted to the left. My name in that handwriting, next to the Queen's 4 careful marks, looked exactly like what it was. A human name. An ordinary person. Someone who had just wanted to do the job. We shook hands again, the Queen and I, both hands this time, in a way that did not have protocol or tradition behind it. Just 2 living things, choosing to reach toward each other. Then the Callaway's common room speakers, which Drake had forgotten to turn off because there were always other things to attend to, played the last 12 seconds of a song that had been in the queue since sometime the previous week. Something soft and old, a piano piece. Nobody could remember who had loaded it. It played. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything. The Queen's 4 eyes were each looking at something different. The paper, the fruit, the ceiling, me. And I had the strange feeling that she was taking it all in. All of it at once, storing it somewhere careful. The song ended. Drake cleared his throat. "Anybody want coffee?" he said. "The machine is broken, but I can do tea." Pete Garland laughed first, then Addie. Then, one by one, other people in the room. The Queen's translator rendered the laughter. She listened to it with what I had begun to recognize as her expression of genuine puzzlement, And then she said a word in Verith that my translator rendered as, the sound of a species that has survived something it should not have, and knows it. Yes, I said. That is exactly what that is. I went back to the medbay afterward. I sat in the chair beside bed 4, where nobody was currently lying, and I looked at the walls, which were still covered in the supply inventory I had written out during the ORT engagement. Bandages, medications, surgical tools, all of it counted and recorded in my handwriting, the same compact leftward slant. I thought about the planet outside, going about its morning, its schools and its coffee, and its ordinary things. I thought about Dorothy Ware, who had already returned the Mildred to its regular route and sent a message to Earth Command that said simply, "Glad that's sorted." Delivery schedule? I thought about Cal and Nora and Sparks and Pete Jr., who had been flown back to Earth and were currently, according to the report I had received, in a great deal of trouble with their school for missing the past 3 weeks of classes. I thought about the word the Queen's advisor had spoken, the one my translator could not fully render, the one that meant something like, the state of choosing to continue beyond the point of reason. I thought that was not a bad description of us. Not a complete one. There were better words, probably, in languages I did not speak, and in the Verath tongue that was now adding new entries to its dictionary. But it was not bad. I picked up my pen. I started a new letter to my mother. Not about battles or treaties or ships. About the pears on the table in the common room, and how tired they had looked, and how somehow that had made everything feel exactly, precisely, undeniably real. I told her we were coming home. Outside the Callaway's porthole, the stars were the same as they had always been, the same light that humans had been looking up at for 300,000 years, the same light that had watched us survive 14 catastrophes we should not have survived, fight each other, and stop and fight again, and build things and lose them, and build them again, choose to go forward when going forward made no logical sense at all. The same light that had watched the Queen bend to fit through a corridor on a patched-up mapping ship, and sign a treaty on real paper, and listen to laughter and give it a name. We had not won because we were stronger. We were not stronger. We had not won because we were smarter, or better equipped, or more prepared. We had won because we were exactly what we were, without apology, without modification, without the ability to be anything else, even when anything else might have been safer. I sealed the letter. I went to sleep. I was home in 6 weeks. The tomatoes in my mother's garden were ready, and they were better than I remembered, and I sat in the morning light and ate 2 of them, without standing up, and thought about nothing at all for the first time in what felt like a very long time. It was, without question, the best thing I had ever tasted. And somewhere in a language that had not had the word before, someone was writing it down,